And I'm going to start from very close to the beginning of the book. Your body is never good enough. Sometimes you know this because you're told so. You need to lose weight, says your mother, your doctor, a public health campaign. Is your body beach ready? A billboard demands. The question is rhetorical. The only answer it will accept is no. Sometimes you know this by osmosis. Streamed selfies seep into your subconscious. Appearance anxiety hangs in the air. Everyone is judging, critiquing, shaming. It doesn't seem to matter if the target is another body or your own. The process is the same. Everybody is wrong. No body feels right. Sometimes you receive a compliment. I like your hair. Have you lost weight? Nice ass. It's good to be appreciated, but are these compliments all they seem to be? Why do they leave you feeling worse? Why don't they dispel the feeling that something about you needs to change? Distress about our bodies has reached epidemic levels, exacerbated by social media selfie culture. Our bodies are always under surveillance, must always be camera ready. Only now the camera always lies. No image is left unfiltered, no photo is left unshopped. The ultimate act of courage is to post with no makeup. Sometimes we change the image, sometimes we change the body itself. Body modifications, once thought extreme, are now mainstream. Cosmetic surgery reaches more people and sculpts almost every body part. Members of the British Association of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons, whose acronym really is BAPS, performed 28,347 surgical procedures in 2018, including what they call a sharp rise in liposuction for both women and men. According to BAPS, that rise was driven by the popularity of TV shows such as Love Island and the fashion for women's athleisure clothing. So you get the body to fit the clothing first, right? Body modifications, once thought countercultural, are now simply cultural. Piercings and tattoos are no longer just for goths, punks, and sailors. Last week, my mom got an actual tattoo, tweeted at Joe Moore in 2019. I'm still in shock. Important deets. 1, she's been drunk twice ever. 2, she thinks crap is quite a bad swear word. 3, she got the tattoo on a Women's Institute coach trip to Chester. 4, it's of a ball of wool and knitting needles. And that tweet has been like 32,000 times. And there's a photo of the tattoo, like you can see the mark with the tattoo. So even body modifications, once thought outlandish, no longer cause the bat of a westernized eyelid. They seem unremarkable, even inevitable. There's a brisk market in injecting botulinum toxin, an actual poison, into the face. Or you could have a so-called vampire facial, which also involves injecting things into your own face. This time it's platelets extracted from your own blood. Surgeries that were unheard of relatively recently are now familiar. Labiaplasty, buttock enlargements. In the late 20th century, you wanted small buttocks and no one would mention your labia. In the early 21st century, you want large buttocks and small labia and everybody's talking. Many women will try any diet, exercise, or device that promises to help them get their body back after pregnancy. I Googled get your body back and I found over 5 billion results. The first was a personal trainer offering 13 ways to get your body back into shape after giving birth. Here they are, so you might take mental notes. Number 1, cut out sugar. Number 2, drink lots of water with fresh lemon. Number 3, use a smaller plate. Number 4, slow down. Slow down is not by sitting on the sofa and having a rest with your baby, you understand, but during meal times. Eat with chopsticks or scale down the size of your utensils. Use a small fork and a teaspoon, for example. Number 5, no white bread, rice, flour, or pasta. Number 6, eat soup for dinner for at least 3 nights in a row. With a teaspoon, presumably, although the chopsticks would make it even slower. 7, avoid red meat. 8, eat the rainbow. Every plate should resemble a pride flag. 9, prepare for eating carrots, celery, peppers, etc. in advance. We're not talking mental preparation here. You don't have to psych yourself up to crudité, right? We're talking chopping and bagging. 10, eat a cup of Cheerios or Chex if you need a snack. Surprising, this one. It's got something to do with gluten, something like that. Still not done. 11, do not sit and eat while watching TV. 12, get off your butt, get moving, and challenge yourself to break a serious sweat at least 5 days a week for an hour. And this is the final one. And here I think the irony is almost overpowering. Number 13, breathe, relax, and let go. Well, it's not just personal trainers offering advice either. The third result for Get Your Body Back was the mainstream medical advice website, WebMD. Dedication and patience are key to losing your postpartum baby weight and looking like your pre-baby self again, it instructs. So in the quest to get your body back, which body should you be aiming for? Where along the journey to old age should your body be suspended? Which body should be reclaimed? The very idea of getting your body back suggests that there was one moment when you had the body that was really authentically, naturally yours. On this understanding, our real bodies are not the saggy, stretchy, lumpy, wrinkly ones that somehow we find ourselves in. When women try to get their bodies back, they're usually aiming for the post-pubescent, pre-pregnancy body, a body that exists for perhaps 10 or 20 years of the average woman's 83 years of life. Somehow that minority body becomes not just the ideal body, but the authentic body, the one that most accurately characterizes who you really are inside. In this narrative, the body must be constantly changed, constantly modified to remain true to itself. But why on earth should that particular body, the one that has done so much less than you have, be the real you? This book reclaims the value of the unmodified body. We must insist our bodies are good enough just as they are. My argument throughout is that the unmodified body is a political concept. And by this, I mean that the unmodified body is not only something that exists in the real world as a real material object, it is also an idea that is connected to political processes, relations of choice and power, structures of hierarchy and equality, norms of behavior and understanding. What the body is and what modification means are matters of political significance. This is not to say there is no such thing as biology, or that the body has no reality of its own. The body is a real thing, one that opens possibilities and imposes constraints. We do things through our bodies, and we do things to our bodies. We live in and with them. Fundamentally, we are them. Asserting the significance of our bodies is central to my argument. But the body is also the site of political meaning. It's the surface on which we're expected to inscribe our identities. Its appearance gives or denies access to various positions of privilege, membership of social groups, indicators of esteem. What we look like, who we are, and how we should be treated are closely related. And the dominant message of many contemporary cultures, especially westernized capitalist cultures, is your body is not good enough. It needs to be changed so that it truly represents who you are and so that it meets standards of who you should be. Against this pressure to modify, I defend the unmodified body as a political principle. It is politically significant to resist pressures to change our bodies. Each of us has to operate within the norms and demands of our society. In the face of constant social pressure, we must repeatedly choose whether to comply or resist. If no one modified their bodies, then the norm of modification would collapse. Body modification is a social practice, one that exists as the result of many individual acts of compliance. Individual acts of resistance matter. Refusing to modify our bodies can be an act of rebellion, an assertion of autonomy. But this is not a self-help book. Individual acts of resistance are not enough to overcome overwhelming social norms, bolstered by commercial interests and entrenched inequalities. The costs of resistance are distributed unequally, and not everybody is able to bear them. Body modification can be a coping strategy, a way of dealing with the fact that your body does not meet the standards set for it. Sometimes people modify their bodies, whether through dieting, makeup, or surgery, so they don't have to think about them anymore. Modification can be a route to enhancement, but it can also be a route to invisibility. We cannot always expect individuals to challenge or change the structures that oppress them. What we ultimately need is collective action to disrupt the social norms and structures that denigrate our bodies. There are many sorts of collective action: grassroots activism, consciousness raising, public campaigns, commercial initiatives, legal measures. I discuss some of these in the book. But the first step for collective action is to understand the problem, to look at things a different way. And this book is part of that process. The most obvious objection to my argument will be that body modification is a matter of individual choice. In one sense, I agree. What we do with our bodies should generally be up to us. But I strongly resist the idea that what we do with our bodies is characteristically the result of our choices. Or rather, I'll show how the choices that we make about our bodies are inevitably shaped by our social context and the norms we find there. Our choices must react to the social structures we navigate. These are conditions of power, they are political. My argument ultimately is not that individuals have a duty to resist modification, or that we do anything morally wrong if we decide to modify our bodies. My argument is much more modest, yet still radical. It is that the unmodified body, understood in the political sense I lay out in the book, should be presumed to have value. So the unmodified body is not an ultimate goal. It is not a mark of perfection. It is not a standard to be measured against, not a purity to be preserved, not a badge to be earned. Whether you're permitted to remain unmodified, and the stakes of doing so, depends on where your body stands in various hierarchies: your sex and gender, your class and profession, your race and skin color, your age and weight, your difference and disability. Prizes for remaining unmodified would be prizes for the privileged. Instead, the unmodified body is a premise. It is a foundation. The unmodified body should be defended as a default. It does not have overriding value. Individual bodies should not be judged for their levels of non-modification, but the principle of the unmodified body does have value, and we are in a position where that value needs defending.
I think that is going to be a big question. And the rest of the book is just as good. Really, really powerful. I mean, that's what really struck me the whole time reading it, you know, body image, body positivity, beauty standards and expectations and norms. These are all very relevant in today's conversation, but you really take it a step further and zoom out and look at these issues and these problems with a much wider lens than I think really exists in the conversation today. And you know, it's really refreshing because you're not just looking at the pressures and expectations, but how those pressures and expectations help to maintain social hierarchies and inequalities. So thank you for that. You know, this is really incredibly important work. And I think it's really important in understanding the context within which all of these topics that we're familiar with reside. And like you say, that's going to be the only way that we can do anything about it, is if we learn and observe those. So I want to kind of just go to the basics real quick. I mean, that's a great overview and a great way to set us up for this conversation. But at a kind of basic level, how do you define an unmodified body? What exactly is that?
Thank you so much. So I'm a philosopher, and in philosophy, you know, we define our terms. It's a key thing. But in this book, really defining that is very difficult. That's part of the issue. So when I started writing on this topic, I had a kind of intuition that there is something valuable about leaving the body alone, about the unmodified body. And I'm just fully aware that many people don't share that intuition, but I wanted to kind of explore that and see where it could get me. But I really quickly realized that the unmodified body, it cannot be a literal thing, right? Because whenever we do anything to our bodies, we modify them in some way. So the fact that you're all sitting here rather than going for a run, right, is changing your bodies. What we eat, what we drink, when we sleep, we're constantly modifying and changing our bodies. So the unmodified body can't be a literal thing. It's not a body that is literally unchanged. And so that's where I come to this idea of the political principle of a body that is allowed to be good enough. And so there's all kinds of things we do to our bodies and we must do to our bodies. And sometimes we want to make distinctions and say, well, there's a modification which is for health, let's say, and that's completely different from modification which is for appearance. But in the book, I show how some of these distinctions we try to make actually often break down, how they are blurred, how we may not know why we're doing a modification, how a modification that seems like it's for health in one context, in another context is not considered that way, and so on. So defining the unmodified body is sort of the problem. But I don't answer, but I suggest this political principle of just a body that's allowed to be good enough, however it may happen to be.
Just as it is. So simple.
Yeah.
Yet so radical. And you're very clear in the book, that a defense of the unmodified body is not the same thing as an attack on the modified body.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. It's the systems and structures, again, that keep those in place. So, you say that it's a political concept and you're a political philosopher. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about those structures. What are the kind of mechanisms behind it that we don't see but are there every day, those kind of invisible forces that are pressuring us to modify?
So, I mean, you could start with some sort of empirical findings about the fact that appearance anxiety is just at epidemic levels. So there have been various surveys on this. So one major survey of several thousand people found that I think it's 2/3 of women feel media pressure to have a perfect body, and 70% of men feel ashamed of their body. It's really high levels of appearance anxiety. You see it with young people as well, particularly with girls. So the girl guiding surveys they do every year chart an increasing dissatisfaction and anxiety in girls generally, not all of which is to do with appearance, but much of it is. So we can see that we are in a context where we're all worried about our bodies. And you might say, well, if we're all worried about our bodies, then that's a problem. It's a public health issue, but it's not a problem of inequality because we're all worried, right? But in fact, if you look at how we are worried about our bodies and what we are concerned about, then those images and norms that we feel we have to fit into are often replicating and reinforcing other structures of inequality, whether they are ideals about sex and gender norms and how a sexed body and a gendered body should be presented, whether they are norms about racialized conceptions of what kinds of features are thought of as beautiful or unbeautiful, problematic or unproblematic, whether it is about an idea that disability status relates to the value of the body and that a disabled body needs to be cured and is inferior to a body without a disability, whether it's to do with things like age, class, and so on. So the norms we're trying to fit into reflect and reinforce these structures of inequality. And for most of us, we'll fit into some of them relatively easily, but not into others. Some of us are fortunate enough to have bodies that fit well into dominant ideals of appearance, others not. But these structures of inequality are shaped sort of there all the time. And in the book, I go through lots of different examples to kind of bring that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of examples. And it's interesting because, your body is never good enough is this refrain that we live in. And you talk about how unattainable this perfect body is, that even if, you could ask everyone, do you have one or two things that might make you happier if you changed? Everyone would say yes. But then as soon as you change those things, there'd be two more. And it's just unattainable. But you consider that with this idea that I want to ask you about next, which is how we view our self-worth and our identity is connected to how we view our bodies. And that's just kind of a dire and lethal combination. So could you talk about that connection between how we view ourselves and how we view our bodies? Right.
So on the first point you made, I mean, I think it is the case. I'm not going to ask anybody here, but I think it is the case. If I ask anybody, like, what would you like to change about your body? My guess is that, we'd all have something we could say quite quickly. But let's say one of you didn't and said, nothing. like my body is perfect, I feel like the rest of us would be rather suspicious. Like, who's that person? Right? We sort of expect to be ashamed, right? It's not just that we are, it's that we feel we should be. It's built in there. And so there's this sense of shame. And then there's also sometimes a sort of meta level of shame. So particularly for people who have, let's say, a kind of feminist commitment. So I've had women say to me, I feel ashamed about my body. And as a feminist, I feel ashamed that I feel ashamed. Mm. So there's this, there's really no way to win here, right? We can't go around saying my body's perfect, because that's really not an attractive feature. But equally, the sense of shame that the vast majority of us seem to have is also something we feel shame about. So what do we do? It's we're in a bind. With that connection to, as it were, yourself, your inner self, your identity, there's so many ways that we think of our bodies as reflecting our identity, or that they ought to reflect our identity. And in the book, I give lots of examples of this. So one example is some work that sociologist Deborah Gimlin did on women in a hairdressing setting, right? And she finds in her research that women who go to the hairdresser feel very, very uncomfortable if they feel that their hair doesn't accurately reflect their class and their professional identity. If they feel they have hair that is not reflective of who they are. You see this in the context of, I don't know, whether or not your look puts forward an image of you as being sort of competent, professional, put together, or whether we think of people with body shape, with larger bodies, as being somehow lazy or not putting enough effort into their, their diet or whatever. So we're kind of making judgments about identity through bodies all the time. And again, often these are judgments that reinforce ideals of, discriminatory ideals.
Absolutely. I think, fat phobia is a really great example of that, because you're not just saying that the body of that person is not good enough. You're saying that person is not good enough. It's kind of that. So do you think the current body positivity movement is helping at all with this?
So I think body positivity is a really interesting example. So on the one hand, I think body positivity is much better than body negativity, right? Definitely. Yeah, let's go for that for sure. And it might also be that in order to overcome body negativity and the sort of shame associated with our bodies, that body positivity is a kind of necessary counterweight to that, right? So I'm certainly not going to criticize body positivity. But equally, I think body positivity doesn't have the whole answer. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is that body positivity, in a way, gives us another thing we can feel bad about. Like, we don't love our bodies enough. So at the very end of the book, I have a quote from an amazing song by songwriter Rachel Lark. And the song is called All the Other Women Should Love Their Bodies, But I Want to Lose 5 pounds, right? It's that idea of, the song is, she doesn't even manage to love her body properly, right? So again, I want us to get away from the idea that the solution to this is us as individuals changing our attitudes or changing our beliefs, because we are up against enormous commercial, social forces that are not going to let us get there. The other thing about body positivity that I would say is it's very interesting to see how it is readily co-opted, again, by commercial interests. So Dove is an example of a company which has used body positivity very strongly as part of its message to get you to buy more beauty products, right? And in the book, I analyze a sort of an ad, like a video feature ad thing that Dove did a few years back, where it did this experiment, I think, in a number of cities around the world. It took major buildings like stations, for example, and it, over the doors, when you go into a station, like over one door, it said beautiful, and over the other door, it said average. And anybody going into the station had to choose, do you go through the beautiful door or the average door? And the little video clip, like they interview them, and the message is you ought to go through the beautiful door. And they show all these women like going through the average door, and then their friends go, no, the beautiful door. And again, it's this idea, you have to confront your appearance when you go to the bloody station. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to assess myself as average or beautiful when I go to the train station.
Absolutely.
So I think body positivity can just be another way of making our bodies front and center. Better than body negativity, for sure, but not the only solution here.
Yes, better than bad, but it's not always good. So this question actually comes from Ellie, our director at Trouble Club. I have to give her credit because I had not seen this in the news yet. And this is how do we reconcile this? So we have Lizzo. This is a question about Lizzo, right? So she is kind of spearheading this body positivity movement. She's really at the forefront of it. And she's recently come out with a shapewear line.
Right.
So we're just having a conversation, and we're kind of curious, what do you think about that? And how do you kind of reconcile those two seemingly opposed stances, or maybe they're not?
So I haven't actually seen Lizzo's shapewear line.
I haven't either.
This isn't going to be a comment on the specifics of the line, right? But I guess, so I'd be interested just to know how like Lizzo conceptualizes that shapewear line. And this is a guess, I haven't seen it, but I'm guessing it's something to do with, wearing clothes, wearing shapewear that helps you feel confident. I'm guessing it's part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to criticize any person, woman or man, of any body of any kind, who does whatever they need to do to get through the day in a way that makes them feel better about themselves, right? That is, we all do what we need to do for that purpose. I guess the difference comes when you're advertising a range and when you're presenting that as being part of body positivity. So I'd just be really interested to see how that circle gets squared.
More to come. Maybe we need to have a display.
Right? Exactly. But I mean, of course, shapewear is something that is constant throughout history, just in different names and different contexts. Is it a corset? Is it a girdle? Is it, maybe like the Bridget Jones, like Spanx knickers? Is it like just a different eras? It comes back in a different way.
That's so true. It has always been here. This is just the newest version. So I'd be curious to know, your why you wanted to write this book and what the kind of goal of it is. Because you mentioned, it's not a self-help book. There's only so much that we can do as individuals. So do you really want people to be able to pick this up and feel empowered to make different types of decisions about their body? Is it more for like collective action, as you say, and policy making, or what's kind of your goals for writing it?
Yeah, thank you. So I hope that a reader of this book, I hope and sort of predict that a reader of this book will find some parts where they will feel like, that's exactly right. This resonates. I've always known this. Maybe I didn't think of it this way, but this is just exactly right and fits with my experience. And I expect and hope that that same reader will find other parts of the book where they will feel like, this is very surprising to me. This is shocking to me. This feels wrong. I never thought about it that way. And it's confronting. And I expect and hope that for different readers, different parts of the book will be different that prompt those responses, right? Because in the book, one of the features of it is I deal with a really broad range of body modification practices and ideals. So, for example, critique of beauty norms has been a major part of feminist theory and activism for decades, actually centuries, right? So I talk about that in the book, but I also talk about various other features of body modification for health, the difference between clinical and cultural surgery. So things like circumcision, female genital mutilation, cochlear implants, reconstructive surgery after mastectomy, like a really wide range of topics. And bodybuilding is the first chapter, which is something that I can sort of really change my mind about as the result of going to a bodybuilding competition and researching and learning about it. So I kind of hope that the reader will find that productive clash of things that seem just right and things that seem surprising. I hope that will help us to make connections across practices where we might not make connections, to think about things in a new way. And then, to prompt a process of sort of collective reimagining of how we might do this better.
Yeah, it's definitely made me rethink quite a lot. Okay, you mentioned the bodybuilding.
Yeah,
I was fascinated by that chapter as well. So if you want to tell us a little bit about that and what you learned, you said you learned something.
Yeah, sure. So I said earlier that the unmodified body, that idea, I soon realized that can't be like a literal thing because we're always modifying our bodies when we eat and so on. And so I've looked for other ways that we more commonly conceptualize a body that is left alone in some way. And I see there are three different broad ideas that we commonly find. There's the idea of the whole body, ideas of bodily integrity. There's an idea of the normal body, which comes up a lot when thinking about health, like modification for health to make you normal. And a big idea that comes up all the time is the natural body, right? The idea that we should have a body that is natural. And so part one of the book looks at that idea of naturalness. And I noticed that we use that word natural when we talk about the body. We use it very often about lots of different body parts and body practices. And in some ways, those things are comparable. In other ways, they're really different. So we talk about natural makeup, natural natural bodybuilding, natural childbirth, all kinds of things. And I kind of analyze these in the book. Natural hair, discussion of the natural hair movement. So natural bodybuilding was going to be just one example, a couple of paragraphs. And I started researching it, and it expanded to be an entire chapter. So my question is, what is natural about natural bodybuilding? What's that word doing? And so natural bodybuilding, if you don't know, is bodybuilding that doesn't use steroids, right? That's what it is. That's why it's natural. But why is that natural? Because natural bodybuilders still do a whole lot of very conscious, effortful, artificial things to their bodies, right? They spend huge amounts of time trying to shape them in very specific ways, like exactly this bit stand up and exactly that bit stand up. It's very conscious, deliberate modification. They will use very rigorous ruling, punishing regimes of bulking and cutting, where you alternate putting on muscle, getting big, and then really reducing body fat. So you've got a very difficult regime of bulking and cutting. There are a whole host of supplements, powders, pills that natural bodybuilders will use. When they pose on stage, they are covered, if they're white, they're covered in really, really thick fake tan to highlight the muscle differences. If they're not white, everybody wears body oil. So there's a huge sense in which it seems like it's artificial, right? It's not natural. What's natural about it? And as part of this, I went to a natural bodybuilding contest. And I was really expecting to hate it. I was nervous to go because I thought, okay, I'm going to feel bad about my body. I don't fit in. I don't have anything like a bodybuilder's body. And I also expected that I would feel uncomfortable watching the display because I felt that it would be objectifying. So I went with this great sense of trepidation. And I absolutely loved it. And I came away seeing it in a very different light. So one of the things that was so interesting about it was that the vast majority of the audience were the friends and family and gym buddies of the people on stage. So these are, they're amateurs, right? They're not being paid for this. And so there's people shouting out, "Go on, Dad, you can do it." You know, the other thing that I saw really clearly was that with bodybuilding, it's not just the effort that goes into making the body in the gym beforehand. Also, the act of posing on stage is very difficult. Right? Because it was quite a cold day. I was wearing a jumper and all these bodybuilders on stage covered in sweat, dripping down all the time. And why are they so hot? Like, they're stage lights, but it's not that much. They're only wearing little posing bags. Why are they so hot? And I went back to my hotel room afterwards and tried to have a go at some of these poses. And I don't know if I want to make you do this. You could try it. But I mean, you could try it if you like, we could all do that with our arms, right? But then if you actually do that and try to make your muscles stand up, right, you've got to make your biceps stand up. Okay, now you've got to make sure that these muscles are also standing up. And then you've got to make sure that your chest muscles are also visible. And then what about your neck muscles? Oh, and then what about your abdomen? And are your thighs prominent? Oh, what about the biceps? Right? You stand in front of the mirror, try to make every muscle of your body prominent and tensed and visible, and try to hold that for 20 minutes as you move from pose to pose, and at all times, every muscle, right? You try it, you'll be covered in sweat, I promise you. So I had this new sense of the discipline of that. But I also noticed something really interesting, which is that most bodybuilders are men, but there are women bodybuilders too. And the male competition is divided into categories based on age, and there was a category for people who were novices. So these are categories just to make it fair, right? So that the over 50s, or in fact, there was a man in his 70s, are not competing against a guy in the 20s, right? They're not going to have the same physique. It's never going to happen. So that's a very obvious way of categorizing the men. But the women's competition didn't have age categories. It had different categories based on aesthetic. So there are various different categories, but the two that really stand out is there's a women's physique or bodybuilding category, which is just an analogous one with the men's. So in the physique category, the women have to pose bare feet like the men do. They're not allowed to wear jewelry except a wedding ring. And it's just a complete analogy to the men's category. And that category, we had very few women competing in it. It was one of the least popular in terms of entrance. The much more popular category was the so-called figure category. And in that category, the criteria for judging require that the women have less muscle visible, right? So it's a different aesthetic. They're still incredibly muscly, right? They're still much more visibly muscly than even a woman who regularly goes to the gym, right? They're clearly bodybuilders. But it's a less extreme muscly look. And in the figure category, not only is the aesthetic that they're judged by different, they also have to pose in high heels, and they pose in very high heels. And they may, if they want, and they all do, wear very elaborate jewelry and makeup. And they also, instead of doing this pose with their hands, they do it like this, with their hands like this. I kind of, ta-da! And so it's a more feminine image. That's what's going on. It's a more feminine way of posing, and a more feminine body shape, and a body shape that fits much more closely with dominant beauty ideals. And the reason they have that category is because precisely what bodybuilding is doing is operating within norms of masculinity and femininity. So the male category is the ideal man. And in the book, I chart the history of what that looks like and how it's different, in different eras. And the female category then has this problem because the ideal woman, according to dominant gender norms, is not big and muscly. So how do you get a female bodybuilder? How does that work? And that's where you get the figure category. And just to finish this long story about bodybuilding. So I said at the beginning, I was expecting to dislike this competition and to feel body shamed. And I didn't at all, because it was such a supportive atmosphere. And that wasn't, everyone's cheering. The judges are constantly telling the audience, come on, cheer the people. They've been up there for ages, keep cheering. So it's a really supportive atmosphere. And I also said I expected to feel that I shouldn't be objectifying the people on stage. And I didn't feel that at all until the women's figure category. And I think that's because that category just felt much closer to a beauty pageant. Because the women are precisely closer to a dominant beauty ideal, they are the most mainstream attractive people there on the stage all day. And so it did, for me, have that feeling of, oh, now I'm just objectifying them like we do every day with women all the time. So yeah,
I found that very interesting, that it was just the women's that had the different categories for aesthetics, but men was for size. It's just
and age,
such a stark difference. And while we're on the topic of natural, I thought the natural makeup section was very fascinating as well. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So, as I say, I have a whole part of the book about the concept of nature, and natural makeup is a really puzzling one, right? Because very often natural things are things that are relating to, well, nature is always about a certain kind of value. It's always about attributing to, you say something's natural when you want to say it's good in some way. And so that judgment that something is good relates to a value judgment. And in natural bodybuilding, it's complicatedly related to ideals of masculinity and femininity. And I bring that out in the book. But what's natural makeup? How does that fit in with this? Because natural makeup is makeup that looks like you're not wearing any, right? That's what it is. And you might think, oh, so maybe if like natural bodybuilding is bodybuilding without steroids, if natural nails is nails without putting on acrylics and gels and so on, like is natural makeup also like not much makeup? Is it like easy, quick makeup? But if you look at guides to natural makeup, online in women's magazines, like the absolute cliche that is repeated over and over again is that natural makeup requires a lot of products and takes a lot of time. And it's not quick and easy, and it's difficult, and you've got to see how to do it. And you just find this over and over again. In fact, when I was coming to check all the references to the book, there was one link to an article and online, I think it was Glamour or Cosmo or something, that didn't work. The link didn't work. So I put it into Google to try and check the references were up to date. And they had exactly the same article about natural makeup, but with a different title, right? So it comes back over and over again. It's really difficult, takes a lot of products, got to buy all this stuff. So natural makeup is makeup that is supposed to look as if you're not wearing any. And that aesthetic is an aesthetic that I personally find much more appealing than an overt, glamorous makeup. That's just who I am. I'm an academic. I don't live in a world of glamorous, overt makeup. Natural makeup seems to me the more comfortable kind. And I had this kind of thought unanalyzed that that's also in a way a more kind of compatible with the unmodified body because there's less of it and you're not showing that you have to be like a doll or something. Completely changed my mind about this the more I went into this world, because of course what you're doing with overt, glamorous, obvious makeup is you're doing adornment, right? And it's obvious you're wearing it. And it's, this is how I want to look. I've done this creative design on my face and you can see I'm doing it. Do you like it? And this is how it is. What you're doing with natural makeup is you're pretending it's not there and you're making your face look as if it's not there, but you have to wear it because your face without is not good enough. And in fact, it's a bit shameful. And so I have this term shame-tenance in the book, which is like maintaining shame, what we do to maintain shame. And so the thought with natural makeup is, if I'm not wearing any, you've got my dark circles, you've got my patches, my wrinkles, my spots, my freckles, whatever it is that I have to cover up. I don't want you to know that I'm wearing it, but I also sort of want it to look like I've made an effort. But there's this really kind of careful dance you're doing with the natural makeup. So it's still an aesthetic that I personally find more comfortable than a glamorous aesthetic, but I came to change my view that was, that there's anything natural about it. And I sometimes wear bright lipstick that I wouldn't do before. They're kind of, let's go with the adornment way,
Yeah, because it's really the same. It's just one's just replicating what you would look like without it, and one is adding a bit of color, whatever else you might want. I thought that was really fascinating because same here, that I have the more natural look, but I haven't thought about it's signals that are basically saying, your face is good enough as it is, except for actually it's not. And you got to put in all of this time and money and everything to make it look like you don't have anything on.
Right.
Very so normalcy, that was another, natural, normal, and whole. Normalcy in all of these different areas, they seem very simple and straightforward, and then you just crack them wide open and you see it's not that straightforward at all, and it's actually quite cultural and political when you consider, for normalcy, who is deciding what is normal in the first place. And you had a lot of great stories throughout the book, and I didn't like Hannah's story, but Hannah's story has kind of seared into my brain as one. So I would love if you could share Hannah's story and how this idea of normalcy being political and cultural is kind of representative in that story.
So in the book, I tell the story of Hannah. Hannah is a real woman. She told me the story personally. It's a pseudonym, but it's a real story told to me. So Hannah is somebody who had a double mastectomy in her 20s because she was at elevated risk of breast cancer. So she didn't at the time have breast cancer, but she knew that she needed to have this preventative mastectomy. And she was very, very concerned that she had this very high risk of breast cancer. So she goes on the waiting list for mastectomy. It's not urgent. She doesn't yet have cancer, but she wants it as soon as possible. She gets to the top of the list. She's allocated a surgeon. She looks the surgeon up and she sees that this surgeon is an expert in his field, has publications, has done many of these things. And she's particularly concerned about this because she's really wants to make sure that the mastectomy gets as much of the potentially cancerous tissue as possible. So she thinks, great, I've got a great surgeon, an expert, and here I am. So she goes along to the surgeon and he talks about the operation. And then he says, okay, and so let's talk about implants, breast implants, reconstruction. We'll do that at the same time. And she says, actually, I don't think I want reconstruction. The way she described it to me is she was quite small-breasted anyway. Her aesthetic was quite androgynous. She would just wanted to be flat after the procedure. And the surgeon would not have it. He would not have this idea. So he told her that she definitely should have breast implants, that it was irrational not to want breast implants, that maybe the way she describes it, maybe some elderly women might choose to be flat after mastectomy, but you're young, you're in your 20s, so you definitely need to have breast implants. And in fact, she kind of went back and forth with him, and he actually got to the point where he was saying that he wouldn't do the mastectomy unless she consented to having reconstruction at the same time. And the way he was describing this was it's irrational of you not to want it. A young woman like you in your 20s, it's an irrational view to want to be flat afterwards. So you're not thinking straight. So I would have to do this. And the way she described it to me was, of course, she could have asked for a different surgeon, but then she would go back on the waiting list. She's very anxious about her elevated risk. She believed that he was the best surgeon for the mastectomy part. So she eventually, after quite some arduous, back and forth over various consultations, consented to having implants. And she said, okay, I'll have the implants, but I want them to be the same size or smaller as my natural breasts. So she had the mastectomy, and then she woke up after the operation, and her breasts were, as she put it, massive. That was the word she used. And he had, while she was unconscious on the operating table, implanted larger implants than her original breasts. And the reason he gave was, these look really good on your frame. These are great. So this is an NHS surgeon, right? And I deliberately didn't ask who is this person. I didn't want it's not about an individual person, right? It's about a kind of culture of it. And she was furious. Like, of course she was furious. And the surgeon was baffled. He did not know why she was angry. His view was, these look good. These are the right ones. Why are you so angry? And then the story, it becomes really even more tragic. So it's pretty common for breast implants to need to be redone. There are various ways in which the implantation can not work. They have various things like capsular contracture and infection and so on. And this happened with Hannah. So one of her breast implants, I think it was an infection, I can't recall exactly, it had to be removed. So she lived for a while. In the end, it was a year with one implanted breast and one flat side. And she said that during that year, she felt most comfortable with her flat side, right? So then you might say, well, great, so just have the other one out, right? The problem is, once you've had breast implants, it's much more difficult to get a good wound closure as a flat chest, because you have stretched skin and the scarring is much more puckered and so on. So it's not a kind of simple thing where you can just undo it and go back to the flat chest. I won't go all the ins and outs of the story, but the journey is that she lived a year with one implant and one flat chest. She goes back to the surgeon after a year to have the second implant put in to match. And I said to her, presumably the surgeon was like, must have thought it would have been terrible for you in that year, because he was so concerned that you had to have implants and that it would be terrible to live without implants. So, did he ask you how you were and how it was? She said he didn't ask me anything at all about how it had been. It was just the assumption that this was the procedure. And she thinks that he assumed she was wearing a prosthesis, whereas in fact she didn't. She was visibly one-breasted for a year, you could tell. So the point of this story, this is obviously one person. How widespread this is, we don't know. Whether this is just one person with a particular view, but I've spoken to lots and lots and lots of plastic surgeons who do cosmetic surgery as well. And there is this strong idea of normality. That's what I pick out of it. The idea that he kept saying that she would be irrational, right, to not want reconstruction. And that there was a really, really high value that he placed on the idea of aesthetics, and that he assumed she would too. That having a normal, quote, normal appearance would be so much more important to her than function, than, not having repeated surgeries and other things. And so it's that idea of what normality is and how we weigh it, and how normality in appearance becomes something that is governed in a health setting. That is the kind of the implications I draw out of that story.
Absolutely. And there were other stories that told, the same stories, like about a 14-year-old girl who was, I'm just going to mention this story and then we'll move on and kind of end on a more positive note. But I do find it alarming because, you say in your book, 75% of plastic surgery consultants are male and over 90% of plastic surgery patients are women. And you have stories like this. And there's just one other that I'll just mention that Claire opens the book with, of a 14-year-old girl who was bullied because her ears stuck out. And please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but that's again, right. Seared in my brain. Yeah. Ears stuck out a little bit from her head. She's bullied. Her mom brings her into a plastic surgeon, and the plastic surgeon says, oh, don't worry, I'll fix your ears for you. And while you're here, I'll also fix your nose and I'll fix your chin as well. And did plastic surgery on this 14-year-old on her ears, her nose, and her chin.
Right.
And I loved the question that you asked at the end of that, which is, what is the difference between the bullies and the plastic surgeon? You know, the bullies can point out what is quote unquote wrong with her, but they can't do anything about it. So they're labeled mean and bullies. And the plastic surgeons, they can point out what's quote unquote wrong,
Right.
but he can do something about it. So he's the hero and the good
Right.
guy. I just
Right.
think that really, I mean, anything you would add to that? I kind of took that
Yeah.
story over, but
Yeah, so that story is in the States. It was a CNN report. You can watch it on YouTube. And the added feature that you didn't just recount is that surgery was provided by a charity. I think it's called something like the Baby Face Foundation. I don't remember, it's something like that, which exists to provide free cosmetic surgery to children who have unusual appearance. So this was all provided to her for free as a gift.
she looked unusual because
Yeah.
her chin was a little too square.
Yeah.
All right. So on more positive news as we wrap, because there's how can we decide for ourselves, you know, if there are times where modifying might help with our self-esteem and just existing within this system, these pressures, and we know that it might make us happier or healthier, or all the above, how can we go about deciding for ourselves?
So what a difficult question. So I suppose whenever we think about modification, we need to think about what we expect to achieve, right? And there are two different kinds of things we might expect to achieve. We might expect our body to be a certain way at the end, and we might expect our psychological well-being to be a certain way at the end. And quite often it's much easier to make a prediction about the body changes than the mental changes. And this is something you see very much in the arena of cosmetic surgery. So cosmetic surgeons, you know, pretty well informed about what the body will be like afterwards, right? They've done lots of operations and they know if they do this surgery, this is the likelihood that the desired physical result will be achieved, and they can give you pretty clear ideas on that. What's much less known, because surgeons don't collect the data, and generally we don't collect the data, is whether cosmetic surgery is an evidence-based treatment for appearance anxiety. And the evidence that we do have suggests it's not. We had here my colleague Daniel Ham from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and we did a project on cosmetic procedures in the Nuffield Council. This is one of the main findings that we found, but we just don't have adequate research on the medium to long-term satisfaction with cosmetic procedures and how that affects our well-being. So you can see that in other contexts too. It's just really stark on the cosmetic surgery case. So an interesting fact from cosmetic surgery is that one of the most difficult procedures for surgeons to do is a rhinoplasty, a nose job. Not particularly because it's technically difficult, though it is quite technically difficult, but because it's the most likely procedure where the patient will be unhappy at the end. Because even if the physical outcome is precisely as the surgeon intended and predicted, and the outcome is perfect from that point of view, you go to the mirror, you look at your face, and it's such an important part of your face that quite commonly patients won't be happy with the outcome, even though it's the shape that was agreed. So that's a kind of example of the way that maybe we're trying to think about what a modification will bring us, and maybe we don't know. Right. And of course, if we go to you've all been to the hairdresser, or, you know, we have a haircut, we ask for something like, oh, it's like that bit of Fleabag, you've seen it, you know, where the sister gets that haircut. And they're like, what did you do? What did you do? And then he gets the picture out of the waste paper butt. It's exactly the one that she asked for, right? It's like that. But of course, if it's a haircut, you can just do it differently, grow it differently. And that's why these kind of more temporary body modifications are great. You have to go with it, try the pencil hair, maybe it's going to be good for you. But when we're thinking about modifications that are more permanent, less reversible, you know, it's important to be clear, what do we expect to achieve, and what's the evidence that we're going to feel the way we think we will feel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll have one more question at the end, but is there anything that we haven't talked about tonight that you want to raise and address?
Oh my goodness, there's so many things we haven't talked about, but I'm just sort of happy for it to sit. I mean, I guess I'd just say there's just so many different topics, areas in the book we haven't talked about. With disability, we haven't really talked about modification as being creative and as an act of self-care. That for some people that could be the case. There's a long chapter at the end of the book about the ethics of modification of children, what as parents We have the right to authorize on our children.
Yeah.
There's a long discussion of circumcision, female genital cutting, labiaplasty, and that kind of connection. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that there's lots of different stuff here we haven't
Lots
talked
of
about.
good stuff. Yeah. Maybe we can get in some of that in the post Q&A. But and then to end on a more positive note, what gives you hope for the future? What do you think about the future? And is there anything about it that gives you hope for?
To be quite honest, what gives me hope is when I talk to people at this kind of event, right? And I don't know, quite often people will come to me and they will say, they'll tell me a very sad story about their own anxiety and their own fear and the ways they've been made to feel bad about their bodies and the ways this has affected them. But also sometimes they will come to me and they will say, you know, actually it helps to talk about this context, to hear that other people feel the same way is helpful, to, I don't know, just think about the idea that this might be something that is not an individual failing, but a structural phenomenon is helpful. So I suppose what gives me hope is the idea that in talking together, talking and listening, you know, we can begin a conversation. This isn't the end of the conversation. We can begin a conversation that might take us somewhere better.
Absolutely. Yeah. That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Claire. Wonderful. Thank you. We can take, do we have lots of questions in the audience? I'm just sensing if we want to take a little 5-minute break and then come back and ask questions. I know we've got one geared up, ready to go. Or do you guys just want to move on into questions? I know this is a, maybe we'll just move in. If nobody, I see some nods and hands up for questions. So if anybody, feel free to grab a drink, but we can just move right in. More time. How are you on drinks? You have some more.
Is that one?
Yeah,
that's yeah. I'm good.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. I saw a hand over here first. If you want to kick us off with some questions.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm a huge fan of your work. I thought your book on marriage was pivotal, so I was fascinated to hear you talk about this.
Thank you
as well. I mean, it seems to me that what this always boils down to is the fact that society still values women on their fertility. And for me, kind of everything always comes back to that. So, I mean, you know, when we talk about the sort of ideal look for a woman, I mean, you know, you described it earlier as it's basically it's post-pubescent but pre-pregnancy, i.e. when the woman is at their most fertile.
Right.
The bodybuilders, of course, you know, they always look so good feminine. They've got to look as if, well, you would like, you know, men would like to have sex with them, basically, therefore to procreate. And everything always comes out. I mean, even, you know, the way we talk about the menopause. Yeah. You know, the menopause is talked about as, oh, you know, menopause women, they're done with, they're over, it's all over. I mean, I think that I could talk about this, like, as what I feel like the absolute opposite about menopause. But everything seems to come down to that ultimately. I mean, do you think, you know, when it comes down to it, does everything boil down to the fact that society still vests value in women with fertility, no matter what we do?
That's so interesting. I think there's so much to what you say. I'm just going to offer kind of not a counter, but a kind of something coming into the side of that. So one of the features of the get your body back thing, right? So you could say, well, when you're trying to get your body back, you're trying to return to the state of fertility. Right? That's one way of describing it. Another way of describing it is as we're erasing the evidence of fertility, right? Not showing that your body has now had a baby, has fed a baby, has, you know, it has done this maternal thing. So it's about sort of retaining the body as a certain kind of sexualized object. Is it a, you know, but it's not a maternal body, right? It's not a mother's body. So there's that idea of fertility, but not maternity or something going on. With the body, go on.
The value seems to be in the idea that, you know, if that a woman who could procreate, she's valuable, but, you know, one who's already done it, well, no, kind of on the scrap heap.
Yeah. I mean,
Can I jump? Sorry.
Yeah,
but I was thinking about this all the time you talk about the breast surgery. Personally, I know a lot of people who have chronic illness, chronic pain, endometriosis, adenomyosis, and the reluctance to discuss a hysterectomy in someone who is under 40, under 30, because, oh, you've got no quality of life, you're in agony every day, but you might want a child at some point. It's valuing that ability to have a child over the life you're actually living. And this is just resonating from me from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also
Add that.
perhaps something in that as well of the Hannah's breast surgeon case, which is the idea that women don't know what's good for them as well, something of the infantilizing of
Yeah.
it, I think.
You might change your mind one day. You might, you know, it's such an extreme thing to do. You can't go back.
We know
Yeah.
best.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. There's one kind of a comparison in the book, which is some fascinating research that a political scientist and Courtney Smith did, where she interviewed women in America about female genital mutilation, FGM, and she interviewed women in Senegal about breast implants. The point being that those practices are not common in the place she discussed them, right? And so she started by describing the practices to the women, and then she asked them, what do they think about them? And what's really interesting about that research is that the women in both countries said pretty much the similar thing about the practice from the other country they were discussing. So the things that the American women who were not from FGM practicing communities said was, you know, it's barbaric, it's appalling, and why would you do this? Same thing that the Senegalese women who were from FGM practicing communities said about breast implants. And one of the features they brought out, it was, well, you know, breasts are essential to womanhood because they are essential to feeding children.
Yeah.
That's their function,
Yes.
right? So just as people from a non-FGM practicing community might say, well, the purpose of the vulva is to be functioning and erogenous, and why are you interfering with that? The Senegalese women are saying the purpose of the breast is to be nurturing and to be life-giving to children. So why are you interfering with that? And so you have that, the different way we value different parts of our bodies relating to function and so on. Yeah.
And the big part that culture plays, your whole cultural surgeries, I thought was fascinating with circumcision, which we didn't have time to get into. I know you have a question.
Yeah, I have a comment, stroke question. So I work with women and men and their image. So I'm very much involved with body image. So I am in total agreement with not interfering surgically because my view is that you can improve on your image without the intervention of the knife.
Right.
And really you shouldn't, because the acceptance of the aging process of your body is paramount to the happiness of oneself, and that's part of everyone's life, and there are many ways of doing it. But I also discuss sometimes their willingness to go through surgery because sometimes it's necessary, like breast reduction, breast augmentation, or other types of surgery, which would change their life because it's necessary and it's not a matter of vanity. So that's my comment. And I think that from what I understood throughout this conversation and interview this evening is probably what your take is in certain cases for certain individuals. But what my question was about a comment that you made about your struggle between being a feminist and being proud of presenting yourself in a feminine way, or taking care of your body in a in a certain way. I consider myself certainly a feminist, but I don't have any problem in being glamorous as well.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you where the struggle is, because I don't see the conflict.
That's great. That's great.
That question.
I don't want you to struggle if you have a struggle.
Because I hear this about this from a lot
Okay.
from many women,
Mhm.
but I just don't see the struggle, and I would like to hear it from you.
So I think one of the questions that many of us battle with is how we should operate in the context of inequality, broadly speaking, right?
Yeah.
When we are subject to pressures to put us into categories of inequality and ideals about how we ought to be, how should we operate? Should we comply? Should we resist? Do we have a duty to resist? If we comply, are we bolstering those ideals and those norms that tell us what we have to do? If we resist, are we just setting ourselves up for failure or for shame or for ridicule? So I think there is a really deep, serious problem with what to do as an individual once you identify the existence of social pressures that are themselves damaging, discriminatory, and oppressive. And for some people, you know, the answer is to not to participate and to do a kind of very overt resistance, say, of beauty ideals. For other people, the answer is to embrace beauty ideals and glamour and appearance and to take that very much as an individual act of creativity. For many of us, it's somewhere in between. And it's something like we want to, of course, we want to conform such that we fit in and have an easy life. And in fact, you know, are thought of as successfully fitting in with standards. We want to be successful and accepted, but we also don't want to feel that we are just giving in to pressure. And I think that is the incredibly difficult question for all of us as individuals. And that's partly why the individual isn't, you know, we can't feel that what we do or don't do, what we wear or don't wear is the solution or the answer to whether we are letting down the feminist struggle broadly, right? We all have to operate as we can in the context that we're in. But it just is the case that what we each do individually affects others, right? I mean, all of us here, we're all reinforcing the idea that it's really, really appropriate to cover, you know, the most parts of our bodies when you're out in public, right? Because we're conforming to that and we're reinforcing that. And so we're all getting the message, yeah, this is what we should do. And in fact, we're also sort of reinforcing some slightly more subtle ideas about how we should dress, let's say, with our, you know, the way we're all dressed for an event like this. And we're getting some ideas I can look around like it's not appropriate to wear pajamas. It's, you know, it's quite appropriate to wear whatever, you know, you get this all the time. So constantly what we do is reinforcing these ideals. And I think for women who identify as feminists, for whom a huge part of feminism is questioning dominant ideals of appearance and beauty that women have to fit into, the question is, what do I do now? What next?
I think that my answer to that has always been and will always be that I don't feel any pressure from any media or the society, and what I expect from myself as a woman, I expect also from men. That's always has always been my take on that, but that's me. I don't make any difference. That's probably why I don't feel any pressure.
It's very inspiring.
That's great. Yeah, we need to all channel. In the back.
Thank you. I completely agree with your argument, and I'm one of those women who does feel massively conflicted. I just wanted to ask, have you thought at all about whether if men modified more, if it might have an effect on women feeling differently about modifying or less pressurized to modify, if that makes sense? You know, if you know, men went to the House of Commons wearing earrings,
right,
would that mean that, you know, it would be less likely that, for example, someone would comment on a woman's earrings on the cover of the Daily Mail?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I guess there's different questions here. One is about equality, right? If we're all doing the same thing, then of course that has an equalizing effect, right? I guess the second question is that an improvement? And I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. So obviously there are settings and contexts in which men do very much feel the pressure to modify. It may be differently configured, right? So, I mean, like one man said to me, well, the way I do shame tenance is I never take off my t-shirt at the beach, right? Another man said to me, well, when I read the bodybuilding chapter, I actually had to stop a couple of times and do some press ups, right? Because he felt like, oh, we should, you know. So there may be a different ideal about how men should modify, maybe about muscle. It might be about a certain kind of image that is different than women's. In some social class contexts, the male ideal of grooming is very, very strong. The male ideal of cosmetic surgery is very strong. I mean, the Love Island example, right, that Baps say is really powerful, that men and women are going to be modified, but in different ways.
Yeah.
So I guess I feel like, on the one hand, it's tempting to say, yeah, let's just make the men do it too, and then it's all sorted. But I really would like just to get away from the idea that we have to live in this idea of constant shame and inadequacy. So
no, yeah, and I completely agree with that. I guess it's just if you're saying that, well, some people, you know, like to do that because it makes them feel confident, and that's okay. And I guess what you're saying is actually, as a society, we need to move away from that giving confidence in a way.
yeah, yes, I think that's right. And so one thing people sometimes say to me is, well, you know, what should we do as parents? Like, how should I talk to my, you know, if my child, or particularly my daughter, let's say, you know, is worried about her body, I sort of tell her, oh, you know, don't worry about it, you look beautiful or whatever. And of course, you know, what we're trying to do is move away from the idea that the answer to feeling bad about your body is being told that your body is fine, actually, because, you know, your body's beautiful, you look great, like, because it's trying to move away from the idea that assessment of the body is the thing that matters. But of course, with our children, you know, it's not the case that if we just never comment on their bodies, they won't get body image issues, because body image issues are baked in everywhere. So I think, you know, in that context, then talking about the fact that there are very significant vested economic interests that want to make a lot of money out of making us feel bad about ourselves, so that we buy the makeup, the athleisure, the gym membership, the diet, right, trying to kind of just be aware of this as it happens across the board, trying to find our own individual ways of working our ways through, whether it's modification, resistance, but trying to be aware of what's going on and what we're doing. Yeah.
I think I saw your.
Yeah, I think you've covered some of the issues I was going to raise, but it's just a really sort of personally flooring and very grounding example. I've got a girl who's barely 3.5, and in the last few weeks got a new issue, which is before she goes to nursery, sort of floods and floods of tears, because children at nursery are telling her she's not beautiful enough because she doesn't wear the right clothes. And like I said, I don't know how else to describe it, but absolutely flooring in a sense of just not feeling like I have any resources to deal with this, and not really knowing what the right thing to do and say is. But I think also sort of just it's really quite triggering, actually, of sort of a whole lifetime of I guess experience of those types of pressures, and also making me think, and it's sort of interesting what you were saying, and I'm not saying you're wrong on this, but it really does make me question how much choice we really have. You know, this I'm not a psychologist. I don't really know what's going on with my daughter. I don't know if you know, if this is going to be the beginning of an issue, or it's going to fizzle out in a few weeks' time, and you know. But it is really striking how little choice there appears to be about our social constructs of beauty and what is normal.
And what does this come? You know, how does this? Where does this come from? Why do they tell her that she's not beautiful enough? I mean,
because, well, she tells me it's because she's not wearing the right clothes. So it hasn't got into, and until very, very recently, she was, you know, I'm sure this is partly a developmental phase. You know, she's got barely aware if she was a girl or a boy, and was, you know, not really into, and now it's all about unicorns and fairies and princesses and dresses. And I'm sure there is but it's this sudden sort of crushing reality of how much that social construct is affecting the consciousness of a girl so young.
Have you brought it up with people?
Yes, I have.
That's shocking.
Yeah.
That's their response.
extraordinary, and it's a mixed nursery.
Yeah.
And did she tell you whether it is coming from girls or boys or both?
From girls. The thing is, again, and I didn't know it was at under or somewhere, but I do, yeah, from girls. From girls. But I mean, I find it extraordinary, and I have talked about nursery, and and I don't. This isn't. I guess this is not so much about sort of wanting to seek advice, or I mean, that would be very welcome, but it's just about a sort of just such a grounding reality.
Yes.
Check.
Yeah.
I got something about like child development and something about bullying. So somebody that we both know, Nicola Rumsey, an amazing psychologist of appearance, she and I were just doing some work together, and at this time my oldest son, who had at that time very, very blonde hair, very pale hair, said to me one day, he said, "I really don't like my hair. I really don't like it. It's not like normal. Most people don't look like me. It's not right. I don't like it. It's right." And he came home with this real anxiety. And I was floored, didn't know what to say. And I mentioned it to Nikki Ramsey, psychologist of appearance. My son said this. He started to say he hates his hair, doesn't like it. It's not normal. She said, "How old is he?" I said, "I think he was 6 or 7. No, she said, "Is he 6, 7?" That's right. She said, "Is he 6, 7?" I said, "Yes, why?" And she said, "Because that's the age that children first start to recognize that they're different from others and get a sense of themselves in contrast with others." And her just telling me this, the weight fell off. I would been worrying that he had some deep anxiety that and he said, "No, it's natural. At this point in their life, children notice they're different." And so just that knowing about that was really reassuring. So I don't know about a 3-year-old, but it could be that there are things that I wish we all knew more about this, what are normal phases to go through, when we'll be expecting. About bullying. So very clearly things about clothes and so on are about fitting in, about what you've learned in the context. When I was thinking about cosmetic surgery on children, so this isn't applicable to your daughter who's talking about clothes, but very often parents who want their children to have cosmetic surgery will cite bullying as the reason. So the example of the 14-year-old girl, she's bullied for having large ears. And often parents will seek cosmetic surgery like having protruding ears pinned back, having extra fingers removed, that kind of surgery, because they say they're worried their child might be bullied. I did some research into whether or not cosmetic surgery is an evidence-based solution to bullying, and couldn't find very much. What I found was the majority of bullying, or a significant amount of bullying, is about appearance, right, for sure. But it doesn't matter what your appearance is. You don't have to look, quotes, abnormal to be bullied for your appearance. And there's also, doesn't seem to be any evidence that having your appearance cosmetically corrected makes you immune from being bullied for your appearance. An anecdote about this, I used to be teased in primary school because people used to say that my long fingers made me look like a witch. They're not that long, right? They're just fingers, right? So the point being, I don't have abnormally long fingers, but I had a bit of a worry that my fingers were witchy, and so I think we maybe can all remember times when our appearance was criticized. So in a way, you're never going to escape that, whether it's for your clothes, for your fingers, for your ears, for your blonde hair, whatever it is. And so perhaps part of the solution is saying to your children, people are mean about each other's appearance. It's going to happen again, and that's not. Don't do it. I don't know.
Come on, did you have a question?
Yeah,
Hi.
It feels like the perfect segue. I don't know if mine's a question. It might turn into a question. It might just be a comment.
That's great.
But I was thinking about my relationship with body image, and interestingly my relationship now towards the body positive movement.
Yeah.
And so being mixed race, being a woman of colour, growing up in North West London, I was always bullied for being too slim or skinny, just over 40, and I would have people's parents call me, ask me if I eat, ask me if I'm anorexic, like grandparents comment on it, because obviously culturally you know, in the Jamaican culture and African culture, the bigger you are, the bigger your bum is, the more sexualized you are. I would have men literally like shout things down the street at me. And now that I'm in my 30s, it's really interesting because I look back at that, you know, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old girl who was like desperately trying to put on weight but couldn't because just naturally I'm slim. And I look at her body and I'm like, I was there wearing like 3 pairs of jeans that my dad would get when he crossed me because I got terrible eczema because I wear 3 pairs of jeans and I'd wear things on my waist
To look bigger.
look bigger. And it's really interesting, the body positive movement and people like Lizzo, because I look at Lizzo twerking and well, we used to call bum flicking, and she's got this big bum and she's got these big hips, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, that's great, Lizzo, but I wanted that when I was younger. And then actually, there's loads of cultures where that is really attractive, and actually being kind of having no waist, having no hips, being straight up and down is not sexy, and they let you know it's not sexy. And I guess if this were to turn into a question, it would be through your research and just through your journey with this book, had you come across many points of view from the other side? This is me presuming that a lot of people are striving to be slim, but I spent my whole childhood and my teenagers striving desperately to be anything but slim. And so I wonder whether you have come across that.
Yeah, that's such a kind of powerful story. And I think what it really speaks to is the fact that no one's ever good enough, right? The fact that it's always completely fine to make a comment on somebody's appearance. That's, you know, we think that's completely fine. We can just bring it out. I mean, I remember a similar experience as a teenager being on a German exchange, being in Germany and having the German dad telling me similar stuff, that I should eat more and I was going to be too skinny, and like, yeah. So I think, yeah, and it also shows a kind of cultural specificity of the different ideals. So I think that sort of fits really well with a lot of the themes in the book. And I think it also maybe speaks to, you know, like I say, when you have some, not criticism, but some kind of caution about body positivity, right? Which is that it's not always going to be the same kind of method, that we have to think of the same.
And also, I think with the body positivity movement, that it's still a certain type of body that they're being positive. I feel, you know, on my Instagram feed anyway, it's a certain type of body that people are being positive about. So I'm here for that, and that's great. But it's still lumps and lumps in the right places.
Right. Yeah.
You know, like I'm not seeing someone like me that's straight up and down with a big belly, so I've had 2 kids. Like that doesn't. I still do not fit into that kind of ideal, or the ideal that I see on my Instagram feed. Maybe there is a whole Instagram feed full of skinny girls with big bellies. I don't know.
Well, you know, when we
I'm not seeing it.
Well, I talked about the kind of getting your body back thing, right? I mean, I've had 2 children, and I have the kind of belly that always looks pregnant, right? And I was first congratulated on my pregnancy, I think 10 years before I was pregnant, right? And now I'm a bit older, people don't do it anymore, so that's great. I'm kind of beyond that time. But there was a big period of my life when I would frequently have people comment on my pregnancy that did not exist, right? And so actually, my favorite thing about being pregnant was I didn't have to look not pregnant anymore. You know, and it's like, I didn't want my pre-pregnancy body back. I wanted to keep not my pregnancy body, but I want to keep the fact that it's okay to look pregnant, right? So that's it, isn't it? It's all about, which part of your body gives you grief? Is it your belly? Is it your butt? Is it what is it?
And I guess, I feel like this is empowering personally. I hope everyone else does, and you don't take it as a negative, but that no matter what you're doing, no one's ever happy. Someone's always going to have a negative comment, whether it's for me, like black culture telling me that I should be curvy and have a big bum, or whether it's kind of model culture telling me I should be straight up and down and have a flat stomach. It's like, damn if you do or damn if you don't.
Totally.
Do whatever you want.
Totally. Yeah.
All right, we probably have time for 1 or 2 more.
I'm really interested to hear a bit more about, you touched on disability and disabled body. What struck me when you were talking is that I find it quite hard to separate myself, that you were talking about the kind of personal, individual versus the political, us being the political debate, and I find that quite hard to do for my own body, but I have a disabled son, and I feel quite radicalized by how comfortable people are in commenting on his body, and how I feel it now feels quite radical to just accept his body as disabled and not see that as a problem or something to be fixed. So it'd be interesting.
Totally, thank you. Yeah, no, I have a chapter which addresses some of this exact question. So one of the challenges to my own position that I set myself in the book, right, is, well, of course, the body isn't good enough just as it is, if it isn't good enough just as it is, right? And don't sometimes our bodies need modification for health or for functioning or to alleviate suffering. And the disabled body is the body that is most often brought in that context, right? And as you'll know from your radicalization, as you put it, right? So the disability rights movement has been fighting this very strongly. And they've been fighting the idea that disability is primarily a problem with bodies, and arguing that actually what makes a person disabled is actually things in the environment, whether it's the fact that there are stairs or whether it's the fact that things aren't written in Braille or whatever it might be. It's the way we structure our world around the assumption of a certain kind of abled body. And that's what creates the disability. And the disability rights movement also, as you will know, very critical of the idea that the way to help disabled people is by seeking cure. And there's various reasons why this is not necessarily the best. One is cure isn't always possible. Another is, even if it's possible in the future, there are people who are disabled now. And so the idea of taking resources away from making disabled people's lives better and putting it into the idea of cure is, it's missing some of the existing problems. But also that the narrative of cure, again, is all about fixing the defective body, which needs to be fixed, to be not disabled anymore. But at the same time, none of us can escape the fact that our bodies, all of our bodies, whether we identify as disabled or not, are constraining us in various ways. They might cause us pain and suffering in various ways. They put limits on us. And if we can make our bodies more comfortable, more well-functioning, we want to, of course we do. So there's a kind of tension there, which I talk about in the book. And the kind of conclusion, just to cut to the chase of that chapter, right, is just to say, look, the idea of the unmodified body, that we should allow the body to be good enough just as it is, applies just as much to the disabled body as to a body not identified as disabled. Because it's not about saying, and therefore that's the end. We don't try and help ourselves. It's just saying, let's just let it be good enough. And then let's operate within that basic valuing of our bodies for what they are, and do what we can to make them, travel through life in a more easy way. Yeah.
Did we have any questions on this side? I've been turning this way. Did I miss any hands? I know I had seen one hand. Maybe we'll. Did you still have a question? Yeah, I had seen your hand earlier, and we had maybe two more here, and then we can do the book signing and any other questions we can ask Claire as we get our book signed.
So, kind of a quick one. Well, it's really not, but I was just struck by, first of all, we have a great deal of diversity of cultures. Exactly as you were describing. There's one norm, there's another norm. We also have aging, so that the maybe the younger woman, not always, who wants to change her body, maybe what does she think? And I don't know whether there's been any research around this. 10 or 15 or 20 years on, because the aging process changes. I'm also interested in this idea of truth and falsehood being analogous. We now have to really start thinking about what is truth, what are we being told that's truth, and what is not truth. And I'm thinking about how analogous that is to social norms. Because you keep mentioning, understandably, dominant culture, like for taking over. But there are so many other dominant cultures, depending on which ones you move in. Yeah. So anyway, it's really more of a comment about how diverse our world is. And I'm not saying about a wrong culture, the 3.5-year-old, 3.5-year-old. What was that culture of that kindergarten school, whatever? Why are they not saying there are many ways to be in the world? Yes. I.e., there isn't. Well, there is one. There is truth. I think there really is truth. But how do we navigate? I suppose the question is, yes, many questions, but all that analogousness of the truth and falsehood, and yet also many, many norms. Yes. And many economies.
Well, here's an example of that. So, going back to those of us who feel conflicted by feminism and what we do with our bodies and so on, for quite a long time, I felt quite before I wrote this book and researched this book, I felt quite smug and self-satisfied with myself. I was resisting the makeup norm. And I don't wear makeup, and this was, well done me, I had succeeded. Until I met somebody who then became a very good friend, another feminist philosopher, who in a different university, who has always loved makeup, likes to wear a lot of makeup. And she said to me, if you wear makeup as a woman in academic philosophy, you are deeply discriminated against. And as a woman who likes to wear makeup, I have frequently been dismissed, been, not bullied by adults, but, who is this person here, assumed that she had no seriousness. But in academic philosophy, not wearing makeup is easy, it's wearing makeup that's the resistance, right? And I sort of thought, oh yeah, okay, maybe I've not been so resistant. It's easy for me in my particular context not to wear makeup. It would be less easy for me if I were an air steward or flight attendant or something, right? Or if I were working in a very corporate environment where I had to present a very certain kind of so. So yeah, that's just to say yes about the different norms and that they can be quite specific. So this same philosopher, she organized a network of conferences, and there's one conference we both went to where there were people from philosophy and people from gender studies, and it was about beauty. So all of us had read the same feminist texts and the same critiques of beauty. We were there to discuss beauty, theories of beauty from a feminist perspective. And all the philosophers were not wearing makeup, and all the gender studies people were wearing makeup. And again, you could just see, we're all there to criticize beauty, but what you're doing and how you fit in with that depends so much on your context. So
teaching a culture of accepted difference is a very difficult thing to do for all of us, I suspect. That's the thing, that's an idea that we need to do, this acceptance of the other. Deeply ingrained.
Stereotypes. I don't understand the stereotypes. I think one should feel free to do what they like. You're an academic and you can like makeup. What does prevent an academic to wear makeup? And what does a flight attendant prevent not to wear makeup? This is preposterous. I don't understand. And I will always, why does a feminist have to avoid makeup or wax, shave, whatever their legs? Why does a feminist have to have to have hairy armpits? Or, I mean, I was a child of the 70s, and everyone had to burn their bras. I mean, I never understood this, and I'm so passionately against any stereotypes. Honestly, I think that they are there to be burned.
Yes, this is yeah, no, I mean, right on. I think we all support you here in this room. We'll get some mandatory reading here. I think this can help contribute to this future, this ideal future. I have one more question here, and then we will bring us home with this question, and then we'll do some book signings.
So it's clear that people like Dove have missed the mark a little bit when it comes to ads and body positivity. Are there any ads or brand campaigns that you think have done that in a really good way?
So this is so interesting. So what seems to, as a matter of the social scientific research, what seems to work best is simply having a much more diverse set of images to look at. That seems to be the thing that makes the most difference. And just as an anecdotal version of this, right? I mean, I have Facebook, and I often get loads of makeup things on because I start to look on. I'm researching natural beauty, and so then you get more and more, and the makeup comes. But then if you start to look at something else, you get different ads. You know how this goes, right? And I once clicked on a Facebook ad for Snag Tights. Do you know this brand? Which makes tights in every size and every shape. And so I clicked on and I had a look at that. And then quite frequently I'll get lots and lots of ads from Snag Tights, and they feature models that are just enormously diverse in their body shape and size, some with some disabled, many not. And I have found, as anecdotal evidence, just simply seeing that very diverse range of women has made a big difference to how I sort of see myself. And then when I sort of research makeup and I get all the makeup stuff, then the anxiety comes back. So there's an example, snag tights.
Also be because it's really fucking hard to buy tights that fit, and you're like, oh, it's one such for everybody. It's great.
Yeah. So I'm not advocating their tights. I don't know. I actually haven't bought their tights, but I love their adverts. They make me great.